and I shall let everyone in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all are. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am joining you from Istanbul. I'm in my favourite little hotel room that I've got a good deal with. And I was discussing with Anthony Peake, who is obviously here somewhere, but now there's loads of faces. So there's Anthony, there's Anthony. So Anthony and I were discussing the concept of the egregore and how pertinent it is right now. And for those of you who don't know Anthony, Anthony's written lots of books, and we were hosting. I was helping him on his podcast Consciousness Hour for 3 years. So Anthony has written a lot about the idea of the egregore, and I just thought it was a particularly apt subject to discuss now, given the kind of wild climate we find ourselves in. So, Anthony, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the concept of the egregore has fascinated me for, so many years. And it was interesting basically talking about the esoteric traditions. I mean, Israel Regardie and various other individuals, because many years ago I was invited to speak at an event of the Servants of the Light, which some of you may be aware of, which is, I think, the world's largest Western esoteric tradition group. And I was fascinated by their work, and indeed it's very sad to hear that recently Baroness Ashcroft Nowicki, who was the main lady in that organization, sadly died, which I thought was very, very sad. So in many ways, I'd like to probably say that this is in honor of Baroness Ashcroft Nowicki, if nobody else as well, Dolores, as we affectionately called her. But basically, from my point of view... hello, Danny.
Hiya, you're right.
Hi. So going back to what I was actually discussing before, right, just hold on, have we...
No, I think we're all right.
Oh, good. Yeah. It's the way Danny just came bouncing in from nowhere, which is...
He's a disruptor. He likes doing that.
He's an egregorial presence in the most positive sense. But my interest in egregores has been over many, many years because, and as you as I know, when we've been interviewing people over the years, it seems to me that there's a direct relationship between our encounters of non-human intelligences and our own anticipations of what they're likely to be. And I'm particularly interested in referring to the case of the Philip case in the early 1970s in Toronto, when a group of academics created basically a ghost. And that ghost then started manipulating their world. And it seemed to become independent of them. Now, from this, I'd like to point out that we can apply quantum mechanics to this, and we can apply neurology to it, because we know from quantum mechanics that effectively subatomic particles, until they are measured or observed in raised commas, they only exist in statistical format. They only exist as a probability of occurring in one location or another. And it's only when they are measured that that subatomic particle collapses down into a point particle. Now, effectively, this suggests that everything that we consider to be the observable world is influenced by us. It's influenced by our anticipations of what it's likely to be. So it comes as no surprise that throughout history, when we have egregorial encounters, and I'm talking about egregores in its kind of accepted sense, in that one can argue that an egregore is any symbol. Coca-Cola is an egregore. Nazism, communism, these are all egregores of one description or another. And our anticipations of these things seem to bring them into existence. And I'll give the classic example of the sun spinning in the sky at Fatima in 1917, when thousands of people witnessed an event in the sky that clearly was not observed outside of that group, because had the sun spun in the sky, the rest of the world would have seen it, but they didn't. But collectively, these individuals did see it because they were anticipating it and creating, or what I would call collapsing the wave function of their belief systems. Now, this does not mean that these entities aren't independent of us. I would argue that these entities actually use our anticipations of them to come into existence in one way or another. And we know from esoteric traditions, this is exactly from the creation of tulpas. We know that this has been going on for centuries. And I know that a lot of the guys in this group who are involved in esoteric groups will be agreeing with me on this. But the question is, it's a question of how we interpret this, as far as I'm concerned.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. What do you think about the current climate with regards to egregores? Because I've been thinking a lot about Pierre Teilhard de Chardin recently and his concept of the 0 point field, the omega point. And I feel like those things are somehow related, because it does seem with this speeding up of technology, with this nesting of egregores, if you like, that there are too many choices. There's like multiple dimensions being created by thought, and we're kind of collapsing in upon these various different other worlds that we're creating with our minds.
No, absolutely. I think the writings of Teilhard de Chardin, and I've seen some of your postings on that. We need to talk about this because it's an area that's fascinated me for years as well. And of course, the idea of the noosphere, the idea that, that we're moving towards some kind of collective evolution, for want of a better term. And it seems that the world is getting faster and faster. I find it extraordinary how quickly the ideas that we have been talking about for many, many years are now coming to fruition. I mean, one of the other members of the group referenced about dimethyltryptamine and the way in which egregores have been created by dimethyltryptamine trips. And of course, Sarah, you and I have a number of mutual friends that have been involved in this research for many, many years. And of course, some of the results they're now getting are incredible. So one could argue that, particularly your point about the 0 point field, because if the 0 point field exists as particularly, I wrote a book a few years ago with Professor Irvin Laszlo, and Laszlo and I, in that book, were discussing about his concept of the Akashic field, the concept that the old Vedic idea of the Akasha can be interpreted as being effectively the 0 point field, which is a source of limitless energy that exists just at the point of absolute zero. And it seems to us that there is something within this world that our minds don't allow us necessarily access to. There's a broader informational field. And I've argued in my books that depending upon your position on what I call the Huxleyan spectrum, is how open you are to the information field. And I argue that people like myself, who are classic migrainers, can appreciate more of it. People who have temporal lobe epilepsy, people who experience autism, people who experience schizophrenia, all these individuals, their doors of perception, as described by Aldous Huxley in 1954, the doors of perception are getting wider and wider. And it seems that it's almost like a collective evolution now. And there is a fair argument to say that we are co-creating this reality. We are collapsing the informational field around us from our anticipations of what's going to become. This doesn't mean I'm advocating necessarily the law of attraction, but there are elements of the law of attraction that can be applied to quantum mechanics and does seem to make sense.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to some more kind of Hermetic, ancient, traditional views of the egregore. Ike or Lee, do you want to answer to that?
I'll give it a smack. Well, I think it's very interesting, just to comment on what Anthony was saying. Very interesting that the 0 point field and it being sort of synonymous with the Akashic field. I think that's a really important thing, because effectively in ceremonial magic, and I wrote a book about this called Etheric Magic, and it meant to sort of give it a more westernized vernacular for the practicing esotericists, rather than somebody that's purely interested in quantum physics. This is what we're working with. The goal is to draw things out, whether they be energies, whether they be disembodied intelligences that we then interface with through these what we call gateway images, just agreed upon forms, so that you can interact and interface with something that you have drawn out or attracted out of the 0 point field. That could be an energy again as well. This is what it means to do an invocation of elemental earth, elemental fire, so on and so forth. And I think certainly it's extremely relevant to what we're going to talk about today. I do want to kind of go back a little bit, and because in discussions of egregores, you usually see one of two things happening. You see people never addressing the original sort of connotation and etymological meaning of the word, or you see people that are kind of nitpicking and saying, well, the modern, as Anthony referred to it before, the accepted term, the contemporary accepted term is bunk because it didn't always mean this. I don't believe that to be true. I think it's just we've applied a name for something to something that we have experientially come to understand. It's come within our sphere of awareness. Perhaps as we open up to these things again, as Anthony was saying. But initially, we get this word egregore from the Septuagint translation of Daniel, I think is the first time you really see it on the historical record in this context, as well as the I believe the text is actually in Ge'ez. It's like a Southern Semitic language, but obviously the Book of Enoch, right? I mean, there's parts of that are called the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, and that's what this word means. Égrégore. It's a Greek word that means wakefulness, to watch. In Daniel, they serve as kind of this avenging force against King Nebuchadnezzar, right? They're delivering divine justice. It says something to the effect of, by decree of the Watchers, by decree of the Egregore. In Enoch, right, I think most people here are probably familiar with that story. They are angels that were supposed to, I guess, protect, but go down and mate with human females, and they create a race, a hybrid race that we refer to as the Nephilim, which commonly gets translated as the giants. That again comes from a Semitic root, nephel. It just means the fallen, those who have fallen. So around the 19th century, maybe early 20th century, but certainly the 19th century, you have people like Eliphas Levi, right? The French occultist and author, writing about this stuff, talking about this, using these discrete terms in this new context, in this what is now quote unquote occult, perhaps even magical, to use a cliched term, in that context, and he's applying it there. Levy, however, he refers to these things as great cosmic forces of the universe that are intelligent. They're kind of, he writes about it in a posthumously published work called The Great Secret, for anybody that's interested in getting like a PDF or something or buying that book. He talks about them as these cosmic forces of antagonism, similar to the Titans, actually. The way he describes them, very similar to the Titans of ancient Greek mythology. And then contemporaneously, you have people like Blavatsky weighing in, saying things like they're the shadows of higher planetary powers, which are made of light. And finally, you get René Guénon, who his work is coming more back into fashion. Concepts like counter-initiation are really fascinating to people like me. But he starts talking about egregores specifically in the context of they are the collective manifestations or the psychic manifestations, energetic manifestations of the collective psyche. And then from there, obviously, as Anthony pointed out, Israel Regardie, Dion Fortune, right, who actually, she, Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki learned lots from Dion Fortune's work. We all have. She talks about it in a book called Psychic Self-Defense in a really fascinating way. But effectively, it becomes this psychic phenomenon that is working on this theory. And the theory is, the way she conceives of it, is astral etheric, meaning that astral, in the way she's using the term, having to do with the imagination and deeper parts of the psyche, and the etheric being something similar to what Anthony was talking about, the 0 point field. There's this marriage of the two. It's kind of like, it's almost as if, I think of it this way because I'm very visual. You know how they wind cotton candy around the cone. It's like a spool, and it just it sort of weaves almost like a blanket around this thing. That gravitational mass of the psychic energy somehow creates something that appears to be autonomous, and its substance is etheric. And so the question then is, you talk about tulpas, so on and so forth. Does this have objective or autonomous existence? I believe it has objective existence. I've experienced them as well. But, you said to bring it back to Hermetic sources. I mean, what better of an example than Iamblichus of Chalcis, right? The 3rd and 4th century Neoplatonic, really Hermetic philosopher who wrote all about theurgy and developed these sophisticated hierarchies of spiritual taxonomy. He talks about something. He addresses a criticism that another philosopher, Porphyry, posits, and he says, "Listen, the soul, meaning our psyche, right? That's the Greek word psyches, the etymological root of that word, psychology, psyche. The soul cannot create anything autonomous. Spirits cannot be made by human beings because we cannot create the way that gods create. We can't even really behave in the way that something like a daimon, an intermediary spirit, we can't do those things in embodiment." So the question then becomes, and I throw it back to maybe somebody else on the panel, once these leave us, how long do they survive? Do they then become immortal? Is it an indefinite period of time? And one of the key things that I would remind people about what we say about egregores is that they need constant sources of energy and thought and emotion. So it's almost like we create a parasite.
Like narcissists.
Yes.
I wonder if, Greg, you would like to say something to this, because you're the Iamblichus expert here.
Well, yeah, I was listening to Ike, and it's always interesting to listen to, because Ike knows so much about so many different things. I don't recall that Iamblichus ever addresses egregores not by that term.
Right.
So I don't know quite what to say about egregores and Iamblichus. And the reason I came to this is because I'm not really sure what people mean when they're talking about egregores. I'm listening to a few people say a couple of different things, and it's somewhere in the not quite physical, but psychologically real domain, but I don't know quite what we're talking about. And I don't necessarily know if egregores is supposed to be a kind of a negative presence or neutral. And I was introduced to the term by Blavatsky. So, but beyond what Blavatsky said, I don't really know what to think egregores are. And that's why I came. I wanted to find out if somebody could help me understand what we're talking about when we mention egregores. And so that's why I'm here. And I don't think Iamblichus mentions them. That's my only knowledge about Iamblichus and egregores, is nothing to say.
I guess like my feeling was this idea of it being a thought form, it being, like you've said, a intangible, immaterial thought form that's created by psychic activity of human beings, or maybe other animals as well. I don't know. But does anyone think they can answer Greg's question?
I think
Lee.
I think I can have a go. Yes. So basically, in certain ancient traditions, in certain initiatic passages and so on, you do get these issues being addressed more directly. And so, for example, I've always felt that even though etymologically the word egregore is not necessarily attached to or has any relation with the word aggregate, I think it's one of the best ways of bringing it together, because that's very much how I see it. Like, for example, you have the couple. If you're just in a couple, or if you're in a relationship with one direct person, you kind of something begins to grow between you. You form your own bubble, and within that bubble, it's almost as if there's a one being is created from that union or from that relationship. If we bring the term watchfulness or awakeness into this, then we begin to understand that maybe what's being created there, even though everybody else may say that that couple is in their own bubble, what's happening is there's a heightening of awareness of certain realities, of certain factors. So it kind of exists within that small sphere, within that small relationship, and then it sort of grows larger. It then turns into the family. So I know that this is going to sound a little bit like we're going into morphic fields here and that whole sort of thing, to do with morphic fields. But I do feel there's a very strong relationship here between the idea of specific forms that are created. And I know it was mentioned also about symbols being a type of egregore. Yes, they could be, but I perhaps see them as being more trigger points or points of focus. So I wouldn't say that the egregore, the concept of the egregore, is either positive or negative. I would say that it's actually just a function of consciousness itself, and how consciousness begins to operate. So we could even go even further and say certain aggregates or certain regions of the brain work as egregores. And then they have communicative relationships between other aspects or parts of the brain. Again, AI, this has a direct relationship to how these things may begin to function and evolve. But beyond the family, you get a certain egregore within the family. I'm talking about normal, profane, external manifestations of what I understand the egregore to be. Then you have the egregore of the village. Then you have the egregore of the town. On a larger sense, then you have the egregore of the country. Then you have the egregore of the region in the region in the country. Then you have the world zone, the Eastern egregore against the Western egregore, and all of this sort of thing. And then you have the egregore of the planet itself. So it's not a positive thing, it's not a negative thing. But going back into the thing about the objective and the subjective, as I say, I see it as an aspect of consciousness itself. An idea or something from the news sphere can then end up influencing and becoming an objective reality. So I would say it's all of these things. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say at the moment.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Lee. When you was talking, it just reminded me of, I was reading an article recently about how it's been discovered that spiders have this extended consciousness that they think with their web. And I think that that's also another way that I consider the egregore to be this projection of consciousness into the outside world. And I think, generally speaking, we do have the capability for extended consciousness anyway. I just want to get to everybody else who's got their hand up. So Vasilios, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to see you here. Do you want to ask make your egregore?
Yeah, and I'm really happy to be in his company, and thanks. Egregore is a term, I mean, as far as I know from Iamblichus, the term is not being used in the Hermetic tradition of Alexandria or the earlier Greek thing, other than parenthetically. What was created as a term that we're using today is by Eliphas Levi, in form or whatever. So it's Eliphas Levi mindset that is invoked by this term. And the other thing is that yes, there are also, as a physicist, I have to protest about the liberal use of quantum mechanics. What we're dealing here is far beyond quantum mechanics. It's something that is not described in our physics, and it is a quest for the new kind of the new science of consciousness to incorporate that. Quantum mechanics is very mechanical, in a sense. As we practice it now, it's just a tool of computing stuff. But it has a good connection with mystical tradition. That's something that I set aside because I would like to emphasize the difference between the emergent hive mind and the egregore. The emergent hive mind is associated with a superorganism like the bees or the ants or cities of London and the spirit of the city, which is usually associated with the spirit of a great river in all big cities in the world. So you have this idea that there is a collective mind which is emerging or constructed by all the little minds that are constitute this community, and egregore is an independent existence and usually not embodied. It is using some kind of symbols in order to express itself, and I would go with the term that it is aware. In my mind, is aware of what? Is it aware only of its creator? Is it aware of the environment? Is it aware of other things? So this is my question. Know much more about the stuff, and that's all for the moment.
Great. I think that they are really good points. So are you recognizing it as being human created or created by beings of some sort, or that it could have its own independent volition like a god or a demon?
My personal feeling is more Brunian. Like Giordano Bruno was putting forth this idea of the bonding. So it is egregore. It is not. It is a relationship that becomes independent.
Okay, so like Ike was mentioning, there's this idea that it requires our thought in order to succeed. Can it go on to have its own life afterwards?
Yes, and it requires an in-between medium between two consciousness or two monads or two devils. So the bonding that is happening between the one monad in the Brunian sense and another one creates some intermediate expression which has its own characteristic. It does not belong neither to one nor to the other one. Well, they are codependent, but they don't belong. They cannot be reduced to one another. It's something different. And this is the sacred act of bonding. And the greatest bonding is love, according to Giordano. That's all.
Thank you very much. Caz.
Hello. I thought I might give a modern take on the idea of the egregore. I'm a DJ, so when I'm DJing to my crowd, they're first a bunch of individuals, and when I play in the right music, the right sequence of music, at some point these individuals become a crowd, and now I can lead the crowd in a particular way, which it has its own energy. I can say, oh, the crowd was really up for it, or the crowd was a bit slow tonight. I can treat it like one organism. And in answer to the question of how long can it exist, and these deeper questions about it, it is my feeling that if you go from the perspective that there is a all being one consciousness, like Brahman, the everything everywhere all at once, the oneness, and that here on this reality we're living in a maya, a duality. So the 0 point field is another word, I think, for singularity, and here we are in duality. So the collective consciousness can be tapped into by any group of people or animals or beings or whatever. It's almost like just getting closer to that oneness. You see with like starlings, murmurations of birds. Is there one bird leading that, or is this kind of collective intelligence of these birds that follow each other that create this beautiful harmony? Another thing that I reference in my paper is the pendulums in the clocks, that you put a bunch of clocks in a room together, the pendulums will all start swinging in sync. So there is some kind of like vibration transfer that's happening, that's creating this unity. So I think there's many ways that you can look at it, but ultimately it is a collective consciousness that emerges from the thoughts, the beliefs, the energies of all the participants, even if they don't consciously realize it. And once it has been created, it will affect those that are within it, again, whether they know about it or not. And if you do believe that at some level everything is consciousness, it makes it not that difficult to understand why something like this could emerge. Thank you.
Thanks, Caz. iPhone 21, Danny.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, right. Okay. Hello. Yeah, that's my new name. Yeah, there's a book by Mark Stavish on this, and he kind of covers both of those ideas of what egregore is. Either it's the collective thing which is made by everyone in a group, or it's the portal that's made by a group which then lets something in. Someone asked a moment ago about whether it's evil or not. Tomberg reckons yes. He says they're all evil. I'm not sure I would totally agree with that, but one thing that does seem to be common to egregores is that they demand sacrifice, right? For example, if it's your workplace, it's going to demand that you spend time there when you're not spending with your family, would be one example. But it can also demand more harsh sacrifices. Yeah, so they don't necessarily have to be sinister, but they generally are. I think the thing about its awareness or its intelligence, I think you see that quite a lot in what looks like grand conspiracies. I think when a group gets together, united by something, let's say it's greed, it might do things which seem to be coordinated, as if there's some kind of they behind it, and it's, I don't know, selling this thing at a certain time when this thing's also going on. And it does seem that an egregore, I feel that an egregore will move the individual actions of a particular person in that group in a way that harmonizes with other people in that group, to extract something out of everybody. And I think the last thing I want to say is I don't think it is collective intelligence. I think it's something which always or nearly always appears when intelligence collectivizes, in the same way that when you build a bridge, you also create a habitat for a troll under the bridge. And I think that's actually what it is, because I believe that the way you kill a troll is by you bring it out into the light. Yeah, so
they don't like the light, do they?
Yeah. So when it starts becoming clear that, back to that example of your business, your corporation or something, if it's demanding that you, I don't know, work on weekends when actually you don't want to, if you can raise that in a collective and say, well, what is this that's demanding that? Then maybe, you can kind of shine some light of intelligence onto something which is actually sucking your blood. Tomberg, by the way, he was a Catholic theologian. He was the favorite tarot reader of one of the popes, and he wrote a massive book on meditations on the tarot. So that's the kind of perspective he was coming from. He was saying that the Catholic Church has a good spirit, and everything else has an egregore, which is evil.
Yeah, it's interesting. That makes me think of cults quite a lot, and how a cult can develop an egregore and then it's directing its members. That seems to happen quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, finally, he also gave an instruction on how to get rid of it, and it's very easy. You just turn 3 times to the left and recite the first line of one of the Psalms.
That does sound quite easy. Maybe we could all do that afterwards.
I'll dig it up so I can work out which one it is.
Is it the Okie Kokie?
No, that's an egregore of itself. You sacrifice your left hand.
Thank you, Danny. Let me just, Danny's got quite a lot of background sound, so I'm going to mute Danny. PD?
Yeah. Going back to Greg's question and wondering, how do we define this? And I think even though we don't see it addressed in Iamblichus, I really think, Greg, you probably are more familiar with this concept than you realize, because it's really difficult to understand the concept of an egregore without going back to, like Lee said, this aggregate. So let's think about it in terms of the agalmata, the animated statues that are ensouled, right? When we talk about spiritus loci, the genius of a place, a modern observer, if he were to walk into a place and see, for instance, in a tree or in a rock, the very clear delineation of what appears to be a face of a being, the modern tendency would be to say that's Paridolia, that we're hardwired to find meaning, to see faces. It's a survival mechanism, and there's a great deal of truth to that. But on the other hand, what is it behind the substrate of material existence that causes faces, beings to appear as they do? Like we say, the daemons, they make the chips fall where they do in our world by decree of the gods, but it's because there's this inherent underlying meaning. Why do and I hate to borrow terms from physics, but why do the atoms arrange themselves around this locus of being that each of us are? Why does it arrange itself in such a way that we recognize a face? Why do we have a face? This was a question that the Stoics wrestled with, for instance, with their logoi, these seed forms that inform each being, give each being its own kind of appearance. But in terms of these entities appearing and becoming conscious, like I said a moment ago, I think the question of whether or not they are objectively real or not becomes a moot point when we reconsider the definition of reality. Excuse me, the definition of something being real as what is its capacity to affect real change? Because when we look at it that way, let's say that you're being chased by a pack of wolves. You're running from them. Only you can see them, but you're running from them and you run off a cliff. The end result is the same. The equation changes, but the product, the sum is the same. You have fallen off a cliff. Real change has taken place. So I think this is a lot closer to home than a lot of us realize. And while this isn't necessarily Hermetic, it's certainly Platonic, and has precedent within Greek philosophy as a whole. A good example is Vasari at his home in Arezzo. He painted this fresco and immortalized this scene, this event that Da Vinci commented on, Botticelli commented on it, but it was in reference to Protogenes, the painter, and he was obsessed with being able to articulate detail in his work. And he wanted to paint foam around this dog's mouth in one of his paintings, but he couldn't do it. And in a fit of rage, he takes his sponge that he's been painting with and he throws it at the painting. And all of a sudden, he sees that it causes the perfect foam effect he was trying to arrive at manually, but he did it through throwing the sponge, right? So it essentially, for the historical imagination, it uncovers the Paridolia effect, and eventually this is rediscovered. There was a poet, Justinus Kerner, and he had very poor eyesight, and he would write his poetry and his ink would drip onto the paper. And he would fold these papers up, and when he'd unfold them, there would be images that would appear. He called this klexography, but it's the same effect that was eventually rediscovered once again by the psychiatrist Rorschach, what we know as a Rorschach test. So looking at these ink blots that have this symmetry to them that produce images that aren't necessarily there, but we find them there. And once we do, the real question again, it's hard to discuss it without making recourse to something like Jung. And I have my own problems with Jung, especially his interpretations of alchemy. But his overall grand kind of project, I'm on board with, which is basically the idea that we encounter ourselves in the world. We don't know who we are, what we are, until we encounter something that shows ourselves to us. So we experience self as other. So the moment Paridolia, which again, I think is just a word that doesn't explain anything, it just explains it away. The moment that kicks in and we start perceiving a being, an entity in a specific space, are we encountering the soul? Are we encountering the self? Can we distinguish the soul from an ensouled statue, from an apparent being, and from an egregore? I think all of these questions are wrapped up in the same problem. Again, really, Greg, when you first posed your question, the problem here, this is what immediately jumped to my mind, because I think all of these ideas are really inseparable if we're going to tease them out and treat it for what it is.
Thank you, PD. That you really reminded me actually of when I remember being really small and not really associating with being an individual at all, and looking in the mirror and seeing an Italian apartment block, and my tongue was an angry Italian man, and I could look in my mouth and move my tongue around and make weird noises, and I could just live in this other world. So I think that part of our development and our idea of self is survival. Like, we have to survive in this cosmos, and in order to navigate the world that we live on, we have to kind of refine and calibrate our perceptions to be able to not go mad or just survive. So I think part of the creation of self is just pure survival mechanism. And obviously, depending on what you're born into, that can be more or less difficult. Ike.
Hi. So fascinating stuff from everybody. I wanted to just comment because I didn't mean to create any confusion about there being the discrete term egregore on the mysteries, but I agree with PD in that this territory is certainly not far from home for somebody like Greg Shaw. I want to just read the part that I was talking about, just a couple of sentences. He's not talking about egregores. He's talking about the same thing we are talking about, which is the creation of an autonomous being from the power of the soul, and what he has to say about it. Even though he's using the term daimon, right? Because it occupied a specific space in the spiritual hierarchy, but it was a generic term for several different types of spirits. There are punitive daimons or avenging daimons. There are personal or familiar daimons. There are elemental daimons. So it works in the context they're talking about. And my point is to show basically to say I agree with the Iamblichus on the point, and then talk a little bit about that. Perhaps the group could go a little further into it. But he says, now he's talking to Porphyry, you say then that the soul, by means of its inherent powers, shapes the products derived from matter into daemons, especially when the matter is taken from living beings. This is the definition, modernly the accepted definition of basically what an egregore is. Iamblichus then responds to Porphyry and he says, these views seem to me to display an appalling disregard for all theology and for theurgic activity. For one absurdity appears from the outset. If daemons are deemed to be created imperishable, and another, even more appalling absurdity, is if they are created. He goes on to say, moreover, how is it possible that the activities of a divisible soul held fast in a body, that's ours, could be transformed into essence and exist separately by themselves outside of soul? So he is dealing with the concept of an egregore. It's just not called that in this particular section. And my point is to agree with Iamblichus in that my experience of things that we could quintessentially define as an egregore seem to be parasitic or vampiric. Because they, in a way, similar to what Danny was saying, very interesting about this idea that the sacrifices don't have to be blood sacrifices. It's you giving your time, right? Which is like your only non-recoupable resource. But the point is that they can't really, they depend on us for survival because they cannot have autonomous existence. And that concept is supported by what Iamblichus says in De Mysteries.
Thank you, Ike. Just Batuhan, before we get to you, Greg, do you want to say anything to that? Do you feel more satisfied? You're on mute, by the way, so you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm just holding on to try to figure out this distinction. It seems like we're playing around, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but we're playing around with trying to determine whether these egregores have independent existence or they're created by us. And with regard to daimons, the Iamblichus clearly says that they are not created by us. They have independent existence. And perhaps I wasn't listening closely enough to what Ike was saying, and he might have just made the distinction that I'm looking for. But so far, it seems as if, like, who was it Caz, the DJ? Where's Caz? There, yeah. I understood what she was saying about when she's working with a group, and the group tends to have its own mind kind of functioning. Do we create that? Or how much of let's say, Caz is the DJ, finding herself in sync with the group mind as if it has its own kind of entity quality to itself that she's engaging and perhaps working with? That I understand that energetically. I'm not quite sure whether I understand whether it has an independent existence or not. And I'm not even sure that it makes any difference practically. But I don't really have any answers here. I'm groping to understand how we make sense of egregore. But maybe I bungled up what Ike was just saying, but I'm just trying to make sense of it.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I think that's what we're all doing. Batuhan? Yep.
Hello, everybody. Well, first of all, what an incredible meeting. I am Batuhan Bintas. I was one of the volunteers in the DMT research at Imperial College. So I received a huge DMT injection and my brain was scanned. And this was 10 years ago. And ever since then, I've had several other DMT experiences where I met several seemingly intelligent entities. So, and I'm currently running a DMT webinars where we talk about otherworldly intelligences that people meet under the influence of DMT. And Greg, thank you for bringing that back about Caz, because what Caz said really reminded me of something that I experienced. So I speak at festivals, and one of the festivals that I go to is Boom Festival in Portugal, which is the world's largest psychedelic gathering. In 2023, after I delivered my talk, I remember we danced for over 48 hours nonstop, and then at the Boom Festival, like, you have 24 hours music and the beat in the background, and then 80,000 people are dancing to the same beat nonstop, you know. So it does something to your consciousness. You know, you feel one with everybody, as like what Caz was saying. I remember on a Sunday morning, Monday morning, like around 6, 7 a.m., we were watching the sunrise, and I was at the front of the stage, in front of the DJ, and they have this incredible subwoofer that was like facing and like pumping bass to the dance floor. And I remember I like literally stood in front of it, and I turned around and I looked at thousands of people dancing to the same rhythm, and I started questioning, like, no one knows each other here, but it feels like we're one big family. Like, you know, like I feel like I know the guy next to me. Like, I would literally, like, you know, experience you know, you would just look into someone's eye and just like give each other a hug, because I could feel the vibrations like going through the dance floor, and like we were all vibrating to the same rhythm. And at that moment, I had a closed eyes vision, and I saw Shiva, and he was performing Nataraja, and then I started seeing that, you know, the entire collective mind here was just like experiencing Nataraja. And coming back to, you know, what we've been discussing here, I started like questioning, like, are we channeling in Nataraja, like, and Shiva is connecting to us, or we are actually creating this, and Shiva needs us to, you know, tap into this vibration? And that's what Indians also have, you know, experienced back in the days. And then they named it as Shiva and Nataraja, but it's actually, you know, a form of consciousness that is available to everybody to experience. But it was just, you know, one of the most mind-expanding experiences that I've ever had. And I will never forget that. Another experience that I had, you know, on the same dance floor, I would literally see entities dancing around it with us. Because, you know, when you look at it from, you know, from a top-down view, like, imagine like you are otherworldly intelligences watching thousands of people dancing to this rhythmic, and then, you know, and then just becoming one consciousness. So that this is just what I wanted to share. And then thanks, Caz, for bringing that up. You know, that really, really reminded me of that experience. Yeah.
Thank you, Batuhan. That reminds me as well of I met an ethnomusicologist. I was doing some research to make an opera about the descent of Inanna a few years back. And we talked to an ethnomusicologist called Richard Dumbrill, and he specializes in Mesopotamian music. And he talked about how the silver lyre that they discovered in the royal cemetery of they used a descending scale. So every string on the lyre as well, each note was a resonance that was associated with a particular god and a particular stage of the descent. So the music itself was invoking the essence of that journey. And I think that, you know, what that makes me think is how that state, that frequency, that vibration of a state, whether that's elation or fear, that gets transmitted to people. People pick up on it. If you get a group and you get a few people start to feel really scared, then the rest of the group start to feel really scared, and likewise. So I think there is something about, you know, Anthony said he didn't want to talk about law of attraction, but that concept of attraction where like feeling state kind of multiplies and develops. I mean, you just got to look at what happened during Corona vibes, how I wonder sometimes how much the fear state influenced the impact of the COVID itself, you know, because the condition that we're in, the state of fear that we're in, obviously compromises our immune system. Fear is something that compromises your immune system simply, but it also spreads. It's very infectious. Thank you, Batuhan. Siri.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you again for hosting this. I think it's an extremely interesting discussion in the current climate. So I want to offer a couple of things, tying in maybe to some of what people have been saying before. And I want to offer a perspective as a kind of hobby Egyptologist, practicing esotericist and literary scholar all at the same time. So I tend to think of egregores in structurally as rhizomatic. So, you know, if you think of the web of consciousness as like a rhizomatic web, that where you can infuse kind of nodes into that web, meaning like points of contact that can grow, or you travel these neural pathways continuously, right? So, you know, the more you feed into that neural pathway or that thought, then the more that node grows, and the more you kind of understand that something kind of emerges. Now, this idea of rhizomatic structures ties back to Eric Hornung's concept of henotheism in ancient Egyptian religion, where the idea is not that you have a kind of hierarchy, a given hierarchy of gods necessarily, but what you have is like particular daimons or genus loci that you can feed energy into. There are examples in Egyptian religion, for example, where a rather local deity gets fed, gets a cult, you know, a cult center built for it, and then becomes a large deity. The god Amun is an example of this, right? How that changes throughout Egyptian history. So this idea of the kind of henotheistic, every god can be the greatest god, in the context of what you're talking about at the time. So when you are worshipping a certain deity or connecting with a certain deity, you will very often titulate them as such. And many of them can have these different kinds of epithets. And I think it's also interesting, this idea of the watchers and the kind of egregore as a watchful spirit, or has something watchful over it. So to tie this into something a little bit more concrete, posting.
Oh, you've just muted yourself, Siri.
I was actually going to just enter something into the chat. Let's see if I can do that. So there is an interesting hieroglyph that relates to this. It's Gardner's number M12, and this might explain why you don't see this kind of concept in these Neoplatonic texts. So there is the hieroglyph is actually a depiction of a lotus with its stem and its rhizome underneath. It spells ha, or ha, it's like harsh kind of H sound, and then the R. And it refers to 1,000, so it has to do with number and measurement, but it also is used in lots of words that have to do with memory, with thought, and also with this idea of a herdsman watching over something, or a field of something. So the idea also of the lotus, right, where you have something that comes out of a rhizomatic root, grows up, opens up, and gives birth to, let's say, the Ra, for example, or a thought form. So there's something in that mythology of the lotus and its ability to give birth to a thought form. It's quite interesting. I've noticed when I was rereading parts of the Hermetica recently that there are mentions in, I mean, I don't read Greek, so forgive me for just using the Copenhagen translation. There are mentions of this concept of herdsmen and overseers, and those terms would have been spelt with this particular hieroglyph of the plant, right? So it does refer to plants, and it's often used to denote organic growth, but it also refers to these ideas of being an overseer of, and also relates to memory. And I think that's an interesting way of conceptualizing it. So those of you who know much more about how Iamblichus might write about this, or how any of the other kind of Neoplatonic philosophers might write about this, before the term the egregore comes into use, you might kind of be able to see that then in this idea of overseer or herdsman, if that might relate better. Yeah, my 2 cents. And I do have some experience of feeling into the egregores as well. And I think they can be both good or bad, depending on what you feed them. Like thoughts can be good or bad. I don't think they are necessarily one or the other. But
Thank you, Siri. Caz, you said you got to go now, have
Yeah,
you?
I've got to go in 2 minutes. So just very quickly, I was just smiling so hard hearing about this description of Bhutan's party for 48 hours. And just a couple of points about that. Quite specifically, what happens when you're in a party like that is mirror neurons are syncing together, and that's what's creating, you know, on a biological level, this this harmony. But I think one way of thinking about it is starting off by asking yourself, like, what is a human anyway? What are we? And I tend to think of the way I look at it is that there's greater consciousness, there's consciousness everywhere. And our humanity is like a coat we put on that gives us form and shape within this massive, endless, infinite consciousness. And so, you know, if you think about it, here's another way of looking at it. Imagine that there's light everywhere, and in that light, there are boxes, and the boxes have different shapes cut out of them. So all these different boxes are expressing the light in many different ways. But if you were to remove the box, you would just have all the light again. So an egregore is really a sort of a loosening of these box shapes and making a new one from the conscious, like from the amalgamation of everybody's shapes. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I see it. Like, you know, consciousness is everything and everywhere, and my personality and the way that I'm seeing through this little box, you know, it'll disappear one day. It's not the be all and end all, and I'll go back to this, you know, endless soup of everything. So yeah, there's so many more things I could say about this, but I've got to run. So I hope that wasn't too confusing.
Thanks, Caz. Have fun. See you later. Bye. iPhone 21.
Oh, that's me.
Yeah.
I had a question for Caz. Has she gone?
Oh God, no, I'm still go hit me with it quick.
Oh, okay, but I'll be quick. Yeah.
God.
Like when I first got into magic, someone said to me something like this: said, "Be very careful with group work, because when you're doing group work, you can raise a whole lot more energy than when you're doing stuff on your own." And the first time I did do that, I ended up with this like migraine, which lasted a day, and I was quite sick. Something happened. A friend of mine was at a medicine festival a couple of years ago, and he was looking after the fire, and he had to pull someone out of the fire.
Oh God, yeah.
And like, and there was another one at medicine festival where a guy climbed up on a tent and started kind of getting busy with a sharp object. And I remember a Zora. There was a Zora, someone jumped into the fire and someone jumped into the toilet. I'm sorry to bring all this up. What it feels like when I've been involved in kind of group works, and I've done a lot of group works. I used to run sessions back in the day. We always used to start with candles, which is a kind of sacrifice. We always used to sacrifice something. And I wonder if Batuhan, Caz, and anyone else has some perspectives on why it is that at those events, which I'm not trying to be down on them, I really like those kind of parties, but it happened at Burning Man as well. Do you think that people jumping into the fire is, in some way, you could see that as the egregore demanding a sacrifice?
If I could just say something very quickly about that. I don't think that egregores are good or bad. I think that they inevitably emerge wherever there is a group of people. So it's going to happen. And, you know, I heard about that. It's really, really tragic that those things occur. But I think that we can't escape egregores. I think they're inevitable, sort of, you know, like, so it's the collective group energy, and not, you know, all our energy are not the same. And so, you know, maybe that person who jumped into the fire was having an ecstatic moment, and somebody should have been there to make sure that that wasn't going to happen. Whether I see it as a sacrifice, in duality, everything has its price. That's more how I look at it. Like, you know, everything has a cause and everything has an effect. Everything has a price to pay. So everything has a positive and a negative, and that's just kind of how it plays out here. So perhaps that's the balance of this existence.
I guess that the reason I'm bringing it up is because there are like traditionally there are ways of feeding those things before they take feeding, because they're hungry anyway. I wonder if we could kind of broaden our perspective out a little bit and drop some tobacco in a hole quietly, or
Yeah, because you're really giving the egregore a personality in a way that is demanding something. I think that's one way of looking at it, and astrally, if we had time to talk about that definitely is very true. But yeah, possibly. But then again, that's just the energies that you're putting into it. So if you're putting humbleness and asking for safety and sacrifice, and you're putting that energy in, you're already balancing the energies in a particular way. Whether the egregore is actually some sort of like demon that's demanding it, I think that's just a way of looking at it. I'm not sure if you could put it exactly those terms, but that's my opinion on it. I've got to run, sorry.
Thanks, Caz. Thanks, Danny. Pamela?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm wondering if in this discussion, it seems like we're maybe drifting a little bit and talking about thought forms, collective consciousness. And to me, the egregore is I think it's legitimate whether the egregore arises out of thought forms or collective behavior. This goes back to the idea of like the egregore as a daemon or something. But I think that these are different things. That a thought form, while an egregore may arise out of thought form, our general sort of experience of collective consciousness and collective energy does not necessarily create an egregore. When I think the definitions I've heard that comes closest to my own understanding of the egregore is that of Henri Corbin, when he, in talking about the resurrection of Templar orders, he makes the comment that if the spirit of the Templars was ever a real thing, then that energy exists and can be revived. And I think that's kind of important when we look at like reviving initiatic orders, which is something I'm really interested in. I think we're kind of spreading out our idea of thought form a bit in this, a bit of egregore a bit in this discussion.
Thank you, Pamela. Anyone want to answer to that with regards to a more kind of definite kind of Peter? I've got a feeling you're going to be good for this one. You're on mute.
Okay, I'm off now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, just my personal experience very briefly with a very, very energized meditation. I found myself in a Masonic lodge room with a coffin to my right in which I was lying. It had all the kind of tangibility of a real place. And I turned kind of the other way and I entered a tunnel, and it ascended very rapidly into a pool of blinding light in which I was embraced by the most loving and accepting presences that I've ever experienced in my life. And so I have nothing to do with Masonry in this life. So that was curious that I should have entered this mystical experience, I don't know how else to describe it, through this particular avenue. But they were clearly connected. There was a sense in which the aspiration that had built the third degree lodge was connected to a higher order of meaning and significance. And there is a side note to this. My partner, who was also doing this meditation, reported arriving in the same space, but she encountered a kind of speaker's platform from which a large tongue unrolled. So we were she's completely in the symbolic domain here. Like a red carpet, and a booming voice said, "A well-hung tongue." And it was for weeks after she harassed me for the meaning of this, which, of course, I had no idea what it meant.
She's not English, is she?
No, nothing to do. But I happened to be reading Andrew Sinclair's The Sword and the Grail, which is kind of about his ancestral connection to Rosalind and the Templars. And sure enough, in there, there's a snippet of I think, 16th century Masonic question and answer in the Scottish form, in which the question is, what is the key of the lodge, I think? And the answer is a well-hung tongue. So this extraordinarily kind of constellation of symbolic imagery and mystical significance occurred autonomously to me through a highly energized meditation and a higher aspiration. So I just throw that in there as perhaps amplifying a little what Pamela was trying to open as another way of viewing the egregore, as perhaps a portal to our highest aspirations. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Peter. Talking of well-hung tongues, Pascal, is your tongue still numb? Pascal.
I don't know. Is my tongue still numb? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, it does still look a bit numb.
You can see. Okay, I see. You can see the numbness, but at least I'm audible.
Yeah, that's good
and understandable. Yeah, just avoid looking to this part of my. I just had a tooth extraction, everybody. So apologies for that. But I still couldn't miss the event, toothless or otherwise. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so there's lots I would love to say about this, but trying to be sort of succinct about it. I guess everyone's coming from this this kind of magical Hermetic, the Anglican, these other Western esoteric occult kind of ideas and things. But I've got my background in neuroscience, right, and cognitive psychology and stuff. So obviously this idea of egregors is fascinating to me from that perspective. But like always, I'm always trying to reconcile all of the above, So I mean, just thinking of egregors as kind of like archetypes, these archetypal type structures, just types of agents or concepts that many people can experience. Right, and there's this concept of neurognostic structures, which was by Newberg and de Killy, who sort of determined this idea, trying to neuralize the idea of archetypes. So and that could be like an evolutionary thing. It's obviously adaptable for a whole organism to identify things which have been encountered many times, the fundamental ideas and things, kind of through the germline, and that's something that can be kind of neurally resurrected, certain instances, in order for an individual to experience that. And Stephen Zara, who identified the hallucinogenic properties of DMT, he himself said that he presupposes that these entities that people always encounter may well be because these higher order structures are dismantled, and then they allow for these very deep ingrained, he didn't use the word neurognostic structures, but he was referring to the same idea, to be kind of liberated, and then that can enter into our consciousness, right? But obviously, the most interesting thing is if these things that people experience are, can be beyond simply these evolutionary archetypes, can be beyond what I'll sort of speak more to in a second, in terms of just collective expectation, which can then inform kind of hallucinatory percepts, basically. And what can be beyond that is if we have concrete examples, some of which have kind of been alluded to throughout, but not really focused on, which I think is super important to make this differentiation, is if these percepts that people are experiencing are autonomous in some way, like there's actually some kind of evidentiality for that, or at the very least, autonomous or experienced by people who have no direct access or even indirect access to these original ideas. If it's totally alien to them, as it were, and yet they're still experiencing it. But even if it's not that, even if the very content of what they're experiencing, not just the general way in which these ideas or agents can be expressed, but very, very specific manners in which they can be expressed, if they're also encountering it in that way, it becomes much more interesting. And therefore, we can try to invoke ideas, given that obviously we don't have all of the answers to the actual relationship between the brain and consciousness. We understand there is interesting evidentiality for things like telepathy or shared visions, even if it's not fully, confirmed, and that there can be some kind of distributed nature to consciousness itself between brains. Essentially, these agents could potentially operate in a kind of between brain kind of manner. And just philosophically as well, before I just finish on the kind of the more cognitive neurosciencing of predictive processing, philosophically, there's this idea of hyper objects, right? And you can think of anything. So it is very relevant for the egregore concept. Like something like McDonald's is often like a classic example. It's this organization, it's this institution, and it has very, very many levels within it, increasing orders of abstraction. And eventually, the thing in and of itself that is McDonald's is kind of, or the other less kind of mundane concepts. They are essentially sort of beyond classical comprehension. They can't, at that level, they can't be exactly defined. And we as human beings, whatever, we only really see slices of that higher order, like hyper object, because that thing is only defined by its constituents. But anyway, this guy, James Madden, this philosopher, he wrote Unidentified Flying Hyper Object. So he was describing UFOs and UAP as these kinds of hyper objects. So they're these kinds of structures which can be related to this idea of what, as I just described. So yeah, so I mean that's especially interesting, that area, ufology, the kind of these particular alien entities which are encountered, like the greys, whatever. So basically, coming back to the egregore idea and the cognitive neuroscience, to finish on that, there are these very, very repeatedly experienced agents, especially like these gray kind of beings in that field. And yeah, I mean, there are people like Jacques Vallée, John Keel, and things who sort of described. They didn't refer to egregores exactly, but they described similar things in terms of their theories of what these things are. They're kind of these collective intelligences which interface with us as human beings in this top-down way, but interact with our wider cultural systems. And there's an almost control system going on there, but in this kind of bi-directional feedback thing. So the last thing I'll say on predictive processing is that, to me, as a neuroscientist, basically everything about this sort of egregorial concept could theoretically be reduced in a more kind of trivial way to these processes like predictive processing. Ultimately, all that is that the brain works as a predictive engine, and so you have certain beliefs and expectations, and they're technically referred to as priors, right? But if you're in any kind of altered state or specific types of altered states of consciousness, then there's basically less top-down inhibition, okay, of the brain, and that releases it also means that there's less sensory constraint. So there's a liberation of sensory experience, but you simultaneously have high confidence. Your brain will assign high confidence to certain priors. So you're experiencing some ambiguous information or stimuli, but because of this collective expectation, which kind of transmission through like memetics and things like this, just a sort of subgroup has some kind of knowledge which may confer onto this particular ambiguous information it's getting, then that high confidence prior will drive the actual perception in and of itself, right? And for instance, in the kind of the ufological context, which I'm interested in, like suddenly there is this kind of perceptual manifestation of the gray. So everyone has this blueprint for this perceptual construction. But what I would just like to hear from other people is how, all these other perspectives, what do they have to say about the neuroscientific model, but certainly how it can be reconciled, as I've kind of alluded to, but also for concrete examples, like Anthony mentioned about the miracle of the sun. And then someone else just mentioned an interesting one as well, that if there can be like more concrete examples of egregores acting this more autonomous way outside of subcultural knowledge, I'd be especially interested in that.
Thanks, Pascal. That really makes me think about the way dreams function. You know, you have a thought. If you can maintain a sense of awareness when you're in the kind of hypnagogic state, and you have a thought, an idea, or a word, or there's some background sound, it manifests instantly as a thing, as a piece of dream content. So it makes me wonder whether there's something very similar with the way that we perceive these entities.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, PD.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Pascal, I want to address, you know, you definitely hit the nail on the head. That's with the hyper object. That's what I was exactly the lines along which I was thinking in the group chat here, that what we're dealing with are successive levels, a hierarchy of being, where each of these objects, hyper objects, have their own domain within which they operate, but seem to carry some sense of autonomy, that we as egos, as humans, aren't able to perceive completely. But something that really jumped out at me was a moment ago when Peter, when you mentioned your experience talking about the Masonic Lodge and a well-hung tongue. When we look at the old charges of Freemasonry, that language, that's where that language appears, but it talks about where is the key to the lodge held, and it's held in what in the text is called a bone box, and this is an allusion to the teeth, that the teeth is the box, and that the tongue itself is the key to the lodge. So there's like a kind of ambivalence in the way that they're discussing, you know, secrecy, ineffability, and then prudence, really knowing when to say what's right to say at what time. But to bring it back to this discussion we're having on egregores, we see a clear allusion to the same trope in something like the Grimorium Verum, the true grimoire, which the late Jake Stratton Kent, he really gave us an incredible gift when he unpacked what's really happening in this text. But in the opening, the magician is being initiated as a child of Solomon, you know, as a son of Solomon. But Solomon passes this information to him in this ivory chest, and that is directly reflective of this bone box. And in this chest is the key to this whole magical operation. The ability to do everything that's in this text is contained within this bone box or ivory chest. And when we look at the text, before you can do anything with it, before you can operate any of these spells, you have to make contact with a being called Skirlin, which is, it's been related by some scholars to the Holy Guardian Angel in the Abramelin workings, which is this, the idea that The holy guardian angel, we can think of it as our personal daemon, but you're making contact with it, and through that contact, he becomes this mercurial emissary that then gives you access to all of these other spirits that have the capabilities to perform the operations in the rest of the spells. But Skirlin is very similar, very much like what we're talking about here, as an egregore, this figure that must be conjured up, contact with which must be made. But once that happens, we could discuss it in psychological or magical terms. We could say once that happens, it mobilizes the contents of the unconscious, and all of a sudden we have access to these denizens of beings, is the ecology of souls, to borrow a term from McKenna. But yeah, all of this seems very relevant, and it also, and for me, Ike touched on this earlier. It's very common, especially today, when we're talking about egregores, to discuss them in contradistinction to gods, right? Gods exist whether we feed them or not. Excuse me. They persist. Egregores, the moment we stop feeding them, they disappear. And that's a common trope that we see discussed in contemporary magical, mystical circles. But it's really starting to look much different for me, in that maybe it's not so much this thing that just disappears when we stop feeding it, and maybe there is a little bit more involving the self, putting some skin in the game, right? That we are encountering self as other. But once that happens, it kind of unlocks this door that allows emissaries of the unconscious to come through and communicate information that consciously we don't have access to, almost like designated messengers. We've designated this projection unconsciously to bring us something into consciousness. So yeah, all of this is really making me reconsider and reevaluate the picture of the egregore, especially as it's being treated in our current milieu.
Thank you, PD. Lee, you want to talk about the egregore versus the daemon?
Okay, yes. And pull in a couple of other things as well. So I want to draw your attention to the fact that in the Pythagorean tradition, and especially in the golden verses of Pythagoras, there have been many translations of the golden verses of Pythagoras, and so the matter has got a little bit confused. But there's a specific part of those verses which is quite late on, and it appears when it starts to speak about the turmoil and strife that ordinary mortals tend to experience. There's a section where it passes on to stating something which comes quite well together with, I think it was PD Newman, PD, who's put a comment in the chat saying all the gods are present in Zeus. And if we go into the golden verses, O Father Zeus, you could deliver mankind from all their evils or from all their ills, if only you could show unto them their inner daemon. So at that particular point in the text, it specifically brings us to attend to this idea that the daemon is something which exists not just beyond or for each individual, but within each person. So it's almost like has been said, the HGA, the Holy Guardian Angel, that sort of parable. It's an aspect of the self. And if you're familiar with the golden verses themselves, it concludes with the final line. Well, the penultimate line and then the final line. And having put aside your body, you will enter the purest aether, and you shall become as a god, immortal, incorruptible, and death has no more power over you. So that's the aim, that's the goal, that's the end of that process of the golden verses. Zeus is the one that brings the idea to the daimon, that which is within the self. So there's a sort of thing hinted at here that implies that the work of each individual is to undertake that work for that specific outcome. So if you apply that now to everything we've been talking about with regards to the daimon, as I put in the chat earlier, I understand daimon as an individual consciousness. So it's almost the ultimate goal of each individual is to embody that daimon. You are the one who will be the daimon. And so at the end of this, I'm also looking at that if you have a collective of individuals who are undertaking that work together, yes, you can say that then generates an egregore. And that egregore being linked to the original idea of watchfulness means that the more that the consciousness is heightened through the process of people undertaking this work, you then generate a more powerful battery of watchers upon mankind. So this then generates the idea of the daimon and generates the work of the daimon in conjunction with the entire concept of an egregore. I don't think, as we keep saying, I don't think this is a good or a bad thing. I think it's a positive thing if you frame it within the context of what I'm saying. The more of a heightened awareness and consciousness raises, and the duty is that each of those undertaking the great work, however you want to call it, end up being watchers of mankind. You obviously, through that process, have to take on board all of the problems of mankind in order to do that. To be a watcher over it means you must be more and more aware of the fundamental natures of mankind and the problems that we tend to fall into. So I would also add to that an egregore can also be generated through a tradition. An egregore can be generated through transmission. So it exists beyond the collective in that sense, but it's also generated by the collective. So a tradition exists beyond the people inside it. A religion exists beyond the people inside it, but it's generated by the people inside it, because you need to interact with it in order for it to have continuity. So in that sense, people are consecrated into traditions, people are have transmission passed through tradition. You might be, consecrated as a priest, for example, within a tradition. And also you have ancestral egregores. That's another aspect of how egregore is formed through our ancestral links. That's another type of egregore. I think that's it, really. Hopefully that's added.
You said you didn't want to get into morphic resonance, but it also reminds me of you have Turing's idea of morphogenetic fields, and then Rupert Sheldrake talking about Turing talks about morphogenesis, and then Rupert Sheldrake talks about morphic resonance, and it's almost like the body and the spirit together, those two kind of concepts, I think. But it really makes me think about alchemy, which I know you also know a lot about, but also the Ka in Egyptian idea of the soul, that we have this vital essence, and it is like that kind of alchemical process of purifying and refining the vital essence so that it has volition in the afterlife. And that car needs to be fed. That car is a hungry spirit. You have to house it in a statue. You have to have an offering table and make your offerings to it. So what do you think about the relationship between that and the car?
Right, I see the car as being something of a lower nature. It's almost like an intermediary phase of of that process. It's more like we keep talking about the egregore as being like a kind of almost like has a hungry element to it. Well, as I understand it, the car sort of belongs to that aspect or that level of it. Hence the reason why, you have traditions where even with Father Christmas, you give him a sherry and a mince pie. You're keeping Father Christmas sort of alive, aren't you, by doing that and feeding almost like the egregoric car of the idea of Santa. But I think how it works is that we move beyond that level. We become detached from that level. It's almost like in the same way as we need to nourish our physical body while we're here, the car itself needs nourishment, but it reaches a point where it goes beyond. I don't know if I fully answered your question with that.
No, but I suppose one thing I would say then is that with egregore creation, you can create an egregore by accident or for malevolent purposes, or you could create a nice friendly egregore like Casper the Friendly Ghost or something.
Well, as I said earlier, I think egregores are just a function of consciousness, full stop. I think it's it's just the way consciousness interacts with aspects of itself. So egregores are created, thought forms. We keep talking about like how something becomes manifest or how something becomes objectively real. You mentioned the idea of dreams, how something actually manifests inside the dream. And of course, those who maybe have been doing magical paths or magical work, that type of thing, might testify to experiences they've had in their own lives where things that were just ideas end up becoming actual realities. But I think this is something we do all the time. I think mankind does it all the time. And we feed ideas, and ideas do indeed become realities very, very often. Sometimes in a startling way and sometimes in a very subtle way. So I don't think there is much of a difference between the objective and the subjective on many levels.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Well, we've been going for quite a while now, so I reckon we'll like wrap it up. It's turning 6 o'clock here, so maybe 7 more minutes. We can always do part 2. Who wanted Pascal, are you back yet? No, he went to the toilet. Batuhan?
I'm here.
Oh, he's here.
Sorry. I really just would love to pick up a little bit on what Lee said, or rather actually ask. I think there are two just questions I'd like to ping back to people, one of them directed at Lee, because I am really desiring for some kind of integration of the whole cognitive neuroscience thing and what everyone else is saying here, because I don't believe they're mutually exclusive. So one thing is the idea of the watchers and how fascinating that is, that actually what I'm saying about the predictive processing model of egregores can very easily link back to the very origin point of the idea of the egregore, which is the Enochian idea of the watchers, and then of course this idea of this sense, this perennial human sense of being watched, and there being other agents, which obviously in a kind of an extremist is this paranoid hallucinatory sense that if you feel you're being watched, maybe in a climate of cultural oppression or something, then it can, because it affects the nervous system in a way such that you become anxious, etc. It can change it such that you can be predisposed to hallucinatory things consistent with the idea. Hence, you see eyes, you sense agents with eyes watching you. So anyway, I'd love for someone to riff on that, like maybe the climate of the time of when the Watchers was developed as an idea in the first place, but also the idea of what Lee was talking about in terms, which was very alluded to, and I wanted to expand on it in terms of the idea of I mean, initially you said about the different parts or networks of the brain potentially being something which can be considered like an egregore, and how consciousness communicates with itself. So that just obviously alluded to the idea of, you know, this reconciliation of the brain and the idea of the egregore. So two things there. Thank you.
Okay. Would you like me to just quickly answer that, or input on that? Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So in terms of what you were saying about regions of the brain, I mean, it's like we have synapses, we have dendra, we have trees, we have branches. You know, so each leaf is an expression, each branch is an expression. You know, so and they're all intercommunicative. So I think that's sort of what I was meaning by the fact that I keep linking this idea of egregore, watcher, and aggregate. I mean, it sounds similar, you know, etymologically it's not meant to be related, but I've always seen the two concepts as being usefully related if you regard those two words, aggregate and egregore. So you have the idea that patterns and even numbers, even mathematical formula are like forms of egregore, forms of patterning, or bringing or clustering entire things or numerical sequences together. I don't know if I've fully expressed that or answered that properly, but the idea of watchers, you were talking about the watchers, and sometimes you were seeing it as maybe something negative or something. It could be something positive as well. So I think there's also the concept with the daimon, or in other traditions, the holy guardian angel, as being something that watches over you as well. So you there's also the fact that you may be feeling on occasions that you have a benevolent watcher, or something which saves you from disaster, or as I've heard it expressed, you know, tells you exactly what not to do rather than what to do. This is the pushing of the egregoric nature of the self, something which is beyond ourselves already, and on a larger scale, what people call even God could be an awareness, or a conscious awareness, of the fact that we are already beyond ourselves and we are already watching ourselves. So that's also something to think about, something to keep in mind. Happens both on an individual level. You have an aspect of yourself which has already moved beyond yourself. You might even call it your immortal self. And there is the aspect of humanity which is already beyond itself. I think that was kind of alluded to in Batuhan's Shiva experience slightly there as well. So I think that's my view on it anyway. They're questions, really.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Pascal. Okay, so we've got Batuhan, Peter, and Vasilios. Batuhan? Oh, you're still muted.
That's a really incredible discussion, and thanks, Lee, for finishing on Shiva, because I'm going to give two examples. One of them was in my early DMT experiences over 10 years ago. In my second time with DMT, I went through this tunnel, and then I saw this figure with an elephant head. And by that time, like I was an atheist, didn't believe in anything, was raised in Islamic culture. I had no idea about Hinduism. I had not even heard about what Hinduism was. And following week, I had the urge to go to Camden Town. And then I was walking around. I'm like, what am I doing here? What brought me here? I literally had the calling to go to Camden Town, which is part of London where a lot of Indian shops are present. As I was passing by one of these Indian shops, I saw on its wall a drape with the elephant-headed being in meditation. And then it had 6 arms, and I did see this elephant being with 6 arms as well. I was like, oh my God, that is the the thing that I saw on DMT. So I ran into the shop, asked the guy what this is, and then he told me that it's called Ganesh. And then I started doing research on Ganesh. I went to DMT Nexus forums. I started finding about what Hinduism was. And then I found so many trip reports where people, without having any prior knowledge about, Hinduism, they were experiencing these Hindu gods. I was like, how can you explain that? That was my initiation into, questioning, like, do these gods are part of collective imagination because they exist, because their figure is imagined by millions of people across multiple thousands of years, or is it because they actually exist and we tap into their dimension? And another experience that was shared on the DMT webinar last Sunday. So I work with a shamanic practitioner called Stefano from Peru. He runs Entheogens Peru, and he takes people to a lost civilization of ancient Perus and their ritual sites. So he literally takes you to these ancient sites, and then he serves you DMT. And he showed us two testimonies, out of which one was by Graham Hancock, the author of multiple books. Basically, Peruvians, they believed in one of the gods they worshipped was called Viracocha, which was this octopus being with tentacles, known as for healing people with its tentacles. And this one specific ancient altar that he took people to, literally, Graham Hancock saw this octopus being coming and fixing his migraines. Graham has been experiencing migraines all over, like, throughout his life. And he said, in his testimony, he says that he's tried everything, but this was the only, the most powerful healing on his migraines. He literally didn't have any migraines for 3 months. Not only he saw this octopus with tentacles, but like the octopus being as if like it knew exactly what part of his brain was causing the migraines, and he was just like healing those parts. And another person, which this is like I really can't get my head around this, is this woman who was paralyzed, half of her body, like from bottom down, was paralyzed, and she couldn't move for several years. She came to Stefano's retreat on wheelchair after 25 days of working and going to that sacred site and meeting this octopus being several times. She started walking. So, and she, even today, she walks, like, and for me, it's like, it just makes me question, like, do we as humans like have the power and collective magic to put this energy to these ancient sites, or these ancient sites are some sort of like gateway into the quantum field that potentially is, populated by these, otherworldly intelligences? So that is my what I'm really, really fascinated about. And then since I've heard so many people, mentioning morphic fields and morphic resonance, so I just want to share this with you. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Did these people know about Viracocha beforehand, including Hancock?
Probably not. The one woman didn't know about it, but Hancock knew about it. But so that's like, what really fascinates me. So yes, maybe they might have thought about, Viracocha then. But another example, like in my experience, like I had no idea about Ganesh. The only religion I was raised with, it was Islam. And I didn't know anything about, like, elephant-headed being. Another example is like, again, over a decade ago, we had a DMT ceremony in London, and then the room we were in turned into this Aztec and Mayan artwork, and everything in the room, like I could feel this was a dimension that Aztecs and Mayans also tapped into. And then they saw this artwork, they saw these fractals, and then upon their return to default mode of consciousness, after the substance took, ceased to exist in their system, they carved these visuals on their temple walls. Later on, in the morning, I talked to the shaman, and then the shaman told me, I shared this experience with the shaman, and the shaman started smiling. And I was like, well, why are you smiling? He was like, Batuhan, we just came back from Mexico, and this DMT is extracted from the plants we collected on the Aztec and Mayan land. And I was like, wow, like, do the plants like have some sort of like intelligence? And then, they're just like, almost like what are the chances of like, smoking a DMT that comes from that land and experiencing what those civilizations also, express in their art? If anybody has any thoughts on this kind of morphic resonance, I would love to hear.
Batuhan, it makes me think of One of the women I've worked with on my retreats is called Maria Maragou. She's a Greek scholar who researches ancient Greek etymology and morphology, and she's written a book about the Eleusinian mysteries, like everything we know about the Eleusinian mysteries is this thick. And she mentioned the fact that one of the visitors, or one of the participants in the Eleusinian mysteries, went into the telesterion blind, and after his encounter with the divinities was healed and walked out of the telesterion being able to see. And obviously this could be propaganda, it might not be true, but one of the things it makes me think of, because I'm very interested in how a dream can heal someone, because people do report spontaneous healing events happening in dreams. And one of my thoughts about it is that when we're in a lucid dream in particular, and we experience something that feels real, our body responds to it as if it is real. Like there's been evidence to show that athletes, if they practice a particular sport in lucid dream states, that they actually get better at it. And if you think about the condition of lucid dreaming, it's where your frontal cortex is activated, where you have all the genes switched on that are implicated in homeostasis, your body's natural self-healing mechanisms, and you're experiencing this fantastic, blissful, ecstatic scene where someone heals you magically. Your body's in this perfect state to provide a faith healing response. And so I think something might be happening in the way that I see it, of a really deep, impactful experience like that when you meet a divinity, of you almost have a personality split, because I think our personality is like much more fragile than we necessarily can appreciate. And there are cases, I think, of people that have a dissociative identity disorder, where one of the personalities will have a allergic response to something, but another personality doesn't have the same response. So you can bring that other personality to the front, and the allergic response in the body will go down. So I think that our sense of self is a story, and if we are sufficiently convinced that another story is possible, we can change like that.
I mean, can I just add something to this? I mean, I love that our sense of, what was it? Our sense of self is a story.
Yeah, I think it is. You're
so
told
poetic.
You're told a story, and you just go along with it. And this is when we have like big transformative experiences, like people have talked about initiation, or people go on meditation retreat. To have that opportunity to have a blank slate, however it's achieved, and it can be through fear or it can be through ecstasy. I think there does seem to be like a strong emotional necessity to it. Like it's not just, it can't be an intellectual thing. It has to be a very, very strong emotional thing. I think personally.
I mean, what you said, like, I mean, it's a very simple thing that I always question is like, what we call as like the wet dreams. You have an auto dream, and then you wake up,
exactly,
and then, your body reacted. You're like, how is that even possible? How is that even possible? Like,
well,
that's it's incredible.
Well, also the very subtle becomes quite intense in dream states as well, because we're always picking up on sensory information. So like a subtle arousal, like the sheet rubbing the tip of your helmet, could be a fantastic orgasmic experience in the dream state, because you're much more sensitive. So I think that's part of it. Anyway, Vasilios, let's get to you.
Hi, and thanks for this fascinating discussion. Use PD's analogy with a key in the ivory box. I think the concept of resonance is the most relevant, not only morphic resonance, but also what they call the stochastic resonance, the chaotic resonance. There are all kinds of resonances that could explain the appearance of a frequency from different frequencies. So if the frequency organizes things, which it does, then I think that this is a key concept for if someone were to study this egregore phenomenon or concept or whatever. And then I don't want to say more because we're out of time. I would like to invite you to join the Galileo Commission, which is a kind of an egregore, or a collective hive mind of scientists that they go beyond the beyond the materialistic paradigm. and academics, but not only. Any kinds of studies, any kinds of research in this new kind of science that is where we are kind of evoking and we're serving, not leading or promoting. It will be a nice place now. It will be good synchronicity, because in 2 or 3 weeks we're going to launch this Consciousness Initiative group webpage. You can create your own webpage and create your own group and go there, discuss, exchange materials and all that. It's an act of service from the Scientific and Medical Network, and it's not something that you have adhere to an ideology or practice or anything. You are free to do whatever you want. It is a really mycelium-like structure, like a rhizome, as Siri put it. So for that and being grateful, I salute you, and I hope we can continue this into this forum that is Sarah knows very well.
Thank you so much, Vasilios. PD?
Yeah, so we've kind of, with all of these different testimonies, observed the emergence of an egregore in real time here. And we really see this, Batuhan, when you talked about Ganesha and this encounter with this elephant, and Peter mentioned the Masonic qualities, and we got into ivory and bone box. And well, when I went through the 4th degree in Scottish Rite Freemasonry, the thing you're presented with is a balustrade, this a barrier that keeps you from progressing into the sacred. Now, the function of Ganesha, right, is to overcome obstacles. He helps us overcome obstacles. Well, in this Masonic degree, in the 4th degree, you're presented with an ivory key, right? Now, remember, Ganesha is often depicted with one of his tusks missing. Where did that tusk go? We don't know, but we do know that we have a key made from ivory that opens this balustrade, just like Ganesha opens the way, just like Skirlin opens the way, the Holy Guardian Angel opens the way. But this picture is gradually forming in my head of an egregore we have quite literally evoked here this morning, or well, morning for me. I don't know. We're all over the place, but this ivory key that opens the way to the sacred. I think we haven't just been discussing the egregore. I think we've created one.
And now all we need to do is turn around 3 times to our left side and say Psalm 58.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, great. Batuhan, you got a final comment?
Yes, I just wanted to say, because PD just mentioned something incredible, which is like the removal of obstacle. What I find really interesting in my research, I found that people who experience Ganesh without having any prior experience of Hinduism, they always, 90% of the trip reports were like people report seeing Ganesh at the beginning of their DMT trip, as if, in DMT world, people say like breaking through the veil to the other world, as if like when you see Ganesh, that's an indication that, hello, I'm about to take you to the other side. I'm lifting the veil, So, and for me, that was like when I found that, and then found out that thousands of people have experienced Ganesh, not only in their DMT, but at the beginning of their trip, I was like, okay, Hindus were up to something, That Soma thing was psychedelic, They have also like, discovered these things and then called them, the obstacle remover. This is the Ganesh. Other thing that I found interesting is, in my experience, I saw Ganesh's trunk going through my body and healing me. I then found out so many other people who have experienced the same thing, where like the trunk goes through your mouth. It went through my mouth, and I saw people reporting going through their mouth and then sucking the negative energy. The same thing with Viracocha. Its tentacles go through people's like mouth and then suck negative energy. And I can't stop but thinking that, like, a tentacle and a trunk are very, very similar, So perhaps what we call as Ganesh, Indians called it Ganesh, Peruvians called it Viracocha, but these otherworldly entities, they either exist out there or our brain is capable of creating these experiences. In the end, it changes your life. That's what I, focus on.
No, that reminds me of what Pascal was talking about, how we have these kind of models and precepts of how we perceive certain things. And I wonder whether in a heightened sensitive state, you become more aware of your hearing and your sense of smell, and your perception spreads out in a tentacle type fashion. And your way of making sense of that is to create an entity that's tentacled or trunked with big ears. And then for Indians, at least, they had the perfect model in their environment of elephants to base something like that on. But yeah, I think the most important thing is something feeling positive, and we have to create an image to be alchemized, or we have to create a form in order for it to have an effect on us. So I guess that's why we create these images and these symbols and these archetypes, because we have to project our consciousness into something that can have real effects in the world. Someone was talking about before, is like, does it have a real effect? Because this is the only thing that's required really in order for something to be real. And we are all, as we can see right now, people are living in entirely different realities, and yet somehow still inhabiting the same country, the same street, the same house, but are existing in completely different realities. And I guess that's the danger of this kind of fracturing media that we have at our fingertips every day now, where we can just go off into a rabbit hole and create a whole world for ourselves very easily. And I think there's a real danger actually of projecting our consciousness instead of into the real things of nature and other people and relationships, into this kind of like void of devices, where it's, we talk about feeding the egregore. It's like, that's like an egregore that we're feeding with our attention constantly. Ike talked about attention. And I think that it is a good thing to move away from and have more real world engagements. Oh, thank you so much to everyone for coming along this afternoon. It's been wonderful. It's getting a bit dark in Istanbul, so I shall bid you all good night, good evening, good day. And I've recorded this, and I will send everyone, or I'll make available the link, and you can download it. And if any of the other panelists want to share it on their YouTube channels or wherever you want to share it, is absolutely fine. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thanks. That was awesome. Fascinating.